Are you struggling in multi-way pots in your live low-limit Texas Hold'em games? If you are, this video will definitely help you. In this video, we're going to talk about how you can crush multi-way pots in your live low-limit Texas Hold'em games. The first thing that I want you guys to always remember is that most players at these stakes play way too loose. They're just playing way too many hands. They love seeing flops. They play extra too passively, which means we're going to see a lot of limpers, a lot of over-limping, and a lot of over-calling instead of 3-betting to isolate the field out. So at least one player is going to have a strong hand. The more hands that are dealt out, the more players that are seeing the flop, the more likely one of them is going to connect with the flop. So we have to keep that in mind. What that means is that there are going to be fewer bluffs, or at least there should be fewer bluffs. Also, an important thing I want you guys to remember is that your decreased equity in a multi-way pot is more significant than the increased pot odds that you're going to be getting. And what I mean by that is, normally, let's just say you have the best starting hand, pocket aces. Usually, if you are playing this heads up, against a smaller pocket pair, you're going to be an 80% favorite going to the flop. That's a lot of equity right there. But now let's say that you're playing this hand 4- or 5-handed or 3-handed. That's multi-way as well. Your equity is going to shrink. It's no longer going to be as high as 80%. So that applies to all starting hands. The more players that are in the pot, the lower your equity is going to decrease. And even if you might think you're getting great pot odds to see a flop because 7 people have limped in already, it's only going to cost you a big blind to see a flop. That does not outweigh the decreased equity that you have, I think. And a lot of players, I think what happens is players don't realize this. It becomes a leak, especially when they're out of position, especially if they're like in the small blind and they see 6 limpers. Oh, I only have to put in $3 more in a 2-5 game to call and see a flop. But you're going to play this hand out of position, so that's going to decrease your equity even more. I would just fold your garbage hands, especially if they're not suited. So how do we approach multi-way pots? We want to first look at the playability of our hand. Offsuit hands are very bad, except double Broadway offsuit hands. Those have some playability. You want to play hands with nut potential. So suited connectors are okay. Suited aces are okay. High cards are good. Small pocket pairs, which can flop sets. Another key point for you guys to remember is that information is very critical, and you want to get the most information possible in multi-way pots. So what that means is I'd rather check oftentimes and gain more information on my opponents and what the strength of their hands are, instead of just betting on flops because I was the pre-flop aggressor or because I have top pair. Even if I'm in position with top pair in a multi-way pot, I would rather check that back a lot of times because I get to see what they all do again on the turn, how they respond to my check back on the flop. And that is going to be very valuable information rather than betting and then getting check raise, or betting and then getting like 2 or 3 more callers and we just blow up the pot on the turn and we don't know what to do. And of course, we're going to want to defend our own hands much tighter against post-flop bets. If we face any aggression, we know that they are bluffing much lower frequency than if it was a heads-up pot. We have to give them some credit here. If we are faced with a bet, though, we have to now consider how dynamic the board actually is. I mean, if you flop top pair on a 10-high board versus top pair with ace-king on a king-high board, obviously there's a big difference there. The ace-king is going to hold a lot more times than the top pair with 10s. But because the population is raising very linear in these multi-way pots and just not bluffing as often, we want to slow down with our top pair because oftentimes they're scared to bet, like I said. So they're not they're probably not betting a 1-pair hand. A lot of times they're betting a 2-pair or better. We also have to keep in mind that there are other players probably to act behind us, and I think we could just get away and fold more with our top pairs in multi-way pots. And the other exploit here is small bet sizes on flops. They tend to work well with draws and top pair type hands because many players are going to be too scared to raise in a multi-way pot themselves. And if we have a draw, then that works out great for us oftentimes. They're also going to be folding a lot of their mediocre hands. Like I said, if you have middle pair or something like that in a multi-way pot, it's pretty garbage. A lot of players are just going to have to fold that. They shouldn't have probably seen the flop in the first place, but we're playing low stakes, and like I said, players playing too passively and they're playing too many hands, so they get themselves in these spots where they just have to auto fold on bad flops. And that means that if we have a draw, we get a small bet can fold out better hands. It allows us to see a cheaper turn oftentimes because players are too scared to raise themselves. And if we do get faced with a super big raise, right, we can evaluate then, and maybe we get off cheaply by just folding. Big value bets. So in these lower stake games, we're playing against a lot of weaker players that they don't like to fold, right? And they don't make the proper adjustments in multi-way pots, and so they're actually going to call too often. So going back to the top pair scenario, right, where we are probably going to be folding top pair more in a multi-way pot, but other players aren't making that adjustment, so they're going to be calling too often. So what that means is when we flop 2-pair or better, we can size up and get value from players that are continuing with top pair and overvaluing their top pair. And it allows us to get max value. It allows us to build up the pot, which puts them in a very tough spot on the turn and river, and we can potentially play for stacks. All right, so as a quick recap, if you're playing low limit, no limit Texas Holdem in multi-way pots, you're going to be playing a lot of them. You have to remember that pre-flop, most players are just playing way too loose, playing way too many hands. This could be a leak for you. If it is, remember that next time you go to the casino and play. You also have to remember that the increased pot odds does not compensate enough for the decreased equity in your starting hands. You're going to want to play hands that have a lot of playability post-flop and have a lot of nut potential. And after the flop comes out, post-flop, if you're facing any aggression, you have to remember that at least one player probably hit this flop. They are not bluffing you as often as they would be in a heads-up pot. In general, the population at low limit poker just isn't bluffing much anyway, so you have to also consider that. If they're betting, if you're facing aggression, we're going to be folding a lot more top pair type hands, but they're not doing the same thing, so that's where we can exploit them. We can size up and go for bigger bets on our value hands in multi-way pots because they're not folding enough with their top pair type hands. We're going to get paid off a lot more times there. They're not making that adjustment. And also, when we have hands like draws, we are probably going to be using smaller bets because it allows us to oftentimes see a cheaper turn card. It's also going to fold out a lot of garbage, mediocre second pair type hands that are currently better than ours. And if we do get faced with a raise, player dependent, situational dependent, we're going to determine whether or not our hand now has enough equity to continue the hand, or if we should just fold it and give up. But those are the main points that I want you guys to remember when you're playing multi-way pots, and hopefully this helps.